I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the updated 2021 Toyota Land Cruiser Prado Kakadu. And for 2021, there's actually been a pretty considerable change. And that's because underneath the bonnet, there's now more grunt. The grunt that the Prado really deserved from the very start of when it got the 2.8 litre engine, but initially it only had 130 kilowatts of power. Now for 2021, that's been beefed up to 150 kilowatts of power, as well as 500 Newton meters of torque. And as we'll see when we take the Prado for a drive, it's a significantly more relaxed vehicle out on the road because of that extra grunt that Toyota has given it. Now I've brought along the Kakadu here, but in fact the change applies to all four of the Prado grades, which spans right from quite a basic Prado GX up to this fairly expensive and fairly premium Kakadu that you can spot by things like the privacy glass, the darker coloured 18-inch alloy wheels, and additional bright work around the exterior. And personally, I'm something of a fan of the design of the Prado, because even though this shape has carried on for quite some time now, I think it's holding up well. I think it's a handsome vehicle, and given the mechanical changes to the 2021 car, I think we should expect that the Prado will continue in this form for at least another couple of years, even though there's a new 300 series full-size Land Cruiser on the horizon. Now, here in the interior, naturally the Kakadu does get some luxurious touches, but in fact the interior across the range on the Prado isn't too bad. It's well built, the material quality is decent, and while this is a durable vehicle, it is a Toyota Land Cruiser product after all, it's fairly luxurious. Now here in the Kakadu, we've got stuff like wood trim up here on the steering wheel and repeated along the dashboard there, but it isn't too fancy or pretentious. This car has a black leather interior. You can choose cream leather if you prefer a bit of a lift inside, but of course this is going to be the harder wearing color if you've got a family. We've got a bigger screen for 2021. That's another change. For the first time, the Prado gets wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but the system isn't wireless. The integrated navigation looks pretty crisp and is easy to use. However, we've got DAB digital radio and a JBL stereo that sounds just okay. It's not the crispest premium audio in the business, but it renders your music just fine. Now, ahead of the driver, we've got the same analog gauge setup as the Prado's had for ages. They're quite smart looking instrumentation, however, and in between those, you've got a color screen now with a digital speedo, as well as your media and navigation information as well. Speaking of that steering wheel, it's quite a nice unit. Same unit as in the 200 series Land Cruiser. We've got all the shortcut keys you need, old school, ancient cruise control stalk, however. But at least the wheel isn't too big, so it doesn't make you feel too much like you're driving a bus. And we even have paddle shifters for the 6-speed auto that's hooked up to the 2.8 litre turbo diesel engine, interestingly enough. Now in the Prado, there's pretty much a button for everything. Not too much is relegated to the touchscreen. And then we have additional controls down here for the proper four-wheel drive system that you get on the Toyota Prado, as well as things like the rear air suspension, crawl control, and the locking center and rear differentials. We've also got heated and cooled seats here on the Kakadu, which makes a big difference in a hot country like Australia, as well as a fairly generously sized sunroof as well. Now, underneath this armrest, we've got a cool box to keep drinks cold, which is always a nice touch, decent sized glove box, and big door bins as well, plus pretty squidgy materials on the dash, doors, down here where your leg rests. The whole thing is screwed together pretty nicely. Let's check out the second row. Things get off to a pretty good start by the fact the Prado's door opens nice and wide and the roofline is really boxy and conventional, so you don't bump your head on the way in. And sitting behind my own driving position, I'm 6 foot. You can see I've got plenty of space. Headroom, I've got another few inches, even though this car does have the sunroof which eats into headspace, and even this rear seat entertainment unit with a Blu-ray player, if you still have any Blu-rays kicking around. We even have wireless headphones for that setup as well, stylishly packaged in these boxes. Open that up and, I mean, it's sort of faintly like something you might have seen on like Jetstar 10 years ago or something. I think most kids these days would just prefer to use an iPad rather than continue on with an ancient unit like this. But if you differ on that view, you can let me know down in the comments. Legroom is good. Toe room's also fine, and because the floor is pretty much flat, you can even fit 3 adults across in the second row without too much trouble. And if you do that, they'll be appreciative of the fact the Prado does have air vents on either side of the roof, and we have climate controls down here, separate fan and temperature zone here in the second row, plus the outboard seats actually have 2-stage seat heating as well. Now we've got an HDMI port down here for your system, so I mean that's quite cool. You could play video games or something, I suppose. 12-volt socket as well, mat pockets in both of the front seats. And if you've got only 2 traveling in the back, we've got a flip down armrest with cup holders as well. Decent sized door bin still here in the back. We've got soft touch materials, we've got grab handles, so it's all outfitted fairly well. Now the Prado is a 7-seater. You can get a 5-seat version of the base model, but every other Prado, including this Kakadu, has a 3rd row. And we'll overlay some footage here of how easy it is, or not, to get in and out of that 3rd row of the Prado. Heading around the back of the Land Cruiser Prado. Now it is the smaller of the Land Cruiser offerings here in Australia. You can still get the full-size 200 series for at least another couple of months before that vehicle takes a break while we await the arrival of the 300 series. But the Prado is still a pretty large vehicle. We do have a tailgate that opens wide. Now it does mean that you are able to open it just a smidgen and grab something out if you're in a car park. But of course, if you are backed right up against a wall, that's going to be a bit of an impediment. Of course, even though the load height is quite high, there is a decent amount of boot space here in the back of the Prado. Naturally, if you put that 3rd row up, you're going to lose most of that. But we do actually have the ability to raise and lower the 3rd row electronically, which is quite nice. On lesser Prado models, you've got to do it manually. Still not too much of an imposition. Now for the Prado, you do get a full-size spare, and it's mounted right here on the back of the vehicle. That's the traditional way it's always been on a Prado, but you can actually option the Kakadu and the other models with what's called the flat tailgate pack. That gets rid of the spare here, it relocates it underneath the car. It means you lose the second fuel tank for the Prado, but your rearward visibility is a little bit better. Speaking of visibility, we'll check out that issue and the rest of how the Prado drives by jumping in the driver's seat and seeing how this 2021 update runs. So what's the updated Prado like to drive in this 2.8 litre turbo diesel Kakadu specification? Well, it's actually a pretty good vehicle, even though the Prado has been on sale for over a decade in current form, and it's likely to persist for at least another couple of years before an all-new Prado hits the market, sometime after the new 300 series Land Cruiser gets to Australia. But I think the current car is soldiering on pretty well. There's definitely an honesty to the way it drives. It's not trying to be car-like. It's not a unibody crossover sort of vehicle to drive. And if you are coming from something smaller like a RAV4 or a Kluger, you are going to find it a bit of an adjustment in that the Prado just naturally moves around more underneath you, because this is a body-on-frame vehicle. It's not a sort of one-piece vehicle like a car or a traditional car-based crossover SUV. Of course, being a frame vehicle means the Prado is much more wieldy off-road than anything car-based. More articulation is possible, and you'll just get a lot further in the Prado. But that does mean that occasionally it's less comfortable and less athletic to drive in particular than a car-based vehicle. But the Prado can do most things pretty well. Partially that's because we do have a Kakadu spec here, which has extra features like the KDSS suspension system, and it's in fact the only Prado with KDSS available and standard, and it really does change the way this car handles, but I'll come back to that shortly. First of all, let's talk about the changes under the bonnet. So we've got the same 2.8 litre turbo diesel 4-cylinder engine that was used in the Prado in the last few model years, but there's a new turbo and there's a bunch of other small mechanical changes to the engine that have resulted in both more power and torque, but just more accessible muscularity from the engine. So there's 150 kilowatts of power now, and that's up from 130, and 500 newton meters of torque, which is up from 450 newton meters. So pretty good increases in both metrics, and you can really feel them. It's definitely not academic. As soon as you get behind the wheel and you start driving either in town or out in the country where I am now, you can really feel the change to the Prado. In particular, there's just more mid-range torque, and it just makes it more relaxing to drive. I certainly wouldn't go as far as to say that it's effortless. I think in a vehicle of this size and mass, anything with less than about 600 Newton meters of torque doesn't feel truly effortless going up hills or when towing, but the Prado is certainly more capable than it was before. Much of the changes are also attributable to the retune of the 6-speed torque converter automatic transmission, which has been a long time coming. For far too long, the 6-speed auto in the Prado, the Hilux and the Fortuner was almost like it was tuned for a petrol naturally aspirated engine, because it would rev out given any chance to do so. And of course, this engine doesn't have any torque high in the rev range, and so you were hearing a lot of noise, but you weren't sort of going at the horizon really any faster than when it was revving through the mid-range. Mercifully, that's now been changed, and so if you accelerate, the car is shifting before 3000 revs just automatically, rather than letting itself wind all the way out, and that keeps you right where peak torque is, and so it just makes better progress than before. Fuel consumption's also a little bit better. It's not great. Basically, if you have a figure of 10 litres per 100 k's in your head without a massive load on board or something being towed behind, then you'll be in about the right spot for the Prado. In the country, it'll use a bit less. In town, it uses a bit more, but it's not hugely variable depending on environment, which is quite interesting. Now, there's no petrol option anymore. There's no manual option. It's diesel auto only. And of course, that's what most people chose. And we have a permanent four-wheel drive system. You're either in 4 high or 4 low, and that's switchable down here on the center console. The Kakadu then goes further with some additional toys. So we've got crawl control, effectively kind of off-roading cruise control, where you can set a desired pace and the car will try to keep to that. We also have locking center and rear differentials here on the Prado Kakadu, and decent wading depth, approach, breakover and departure angles as well, which I've displayed on screen. In terms of ride and handling, the Prado, it certainly gets the job done. You do see plenty of them in town, but naturally this is a car which is set up for, sort of light or moderate duty off-roading a lot of the time, and the capacity to do heavier stuff with some modifications. The ride itself is pretty compliant. It's neither soft nor hard, it falls somewhere in between. We are on 18-inch wheels here, but they're still relatively small with generous sidewalls here on the Prado. Bumps do tend to shudder the cabin more because we are in a body-on-frame vehicle, but all in all, I'd say the Prado is a fairly comfortable experience. But what you really want, if you can stretch to it, is a Kakadu with the KDSS suspension. This is an Australian-developed technology. It's been in Toyota Land Cruisers for some time now, but it's really only limited to high-spec cars, especially on the Prado. And effectively, it's a system of automatically engaging and disengaging sway bars, which gives you heaps of off-roading capability, super good articulation, but then on-road, those sway bars just prevent the car from having as much body roll as it does with the standard setup. It's actually quite superior in both environments. And so if we pitch into this long left-hander, the Prado, I'm not going to say it sits flat. This isn't a Toyota 8.6, but it's certainly a lot flatter than non-KDSS cars, and it gives you much more confidence to corner at pace, which of course is a factor in the country. Now, we do have a decent amount of safety tech. We've got a 360-degree camera, which helps with parking. We've got AEB. We've got sort of your assist lane departure assistance, where if it detects you're going to leave the lane, the brakes are applied on one side, but it's not a lane centering technology. We've got blind spot monitoring. We've got adaptive cruise control, and we've got rear cross traffic alert. So that's a detailed look at the 2021 Toyota Land Cruiser Prado in Kakadu 150 kilowatt form. There's no doubt that the extra grunt underneath the bonnet of the Prado has really helped this vehicle feel more capable and more relaxed on Australian roads. It's an easier thing to live with if you have to do overtaking. It's also going to be easier to tow with thanks to the extra torque. That being said, unless you plan to use the Prado off-road quite consistently, or really tap into that towing capacity quite a lot, something like a Hyundai Palisade offers you a more comfortable, road-focused alternative to a vehicle like the Prado, still with 7 or 8 seats. So that's something that I would cross-shop if you weren't actually going to use the off-roading capability of this vehicle terribly much. But of course, you can let me know what you think down below this video in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.